All right, welcome back to practice cross-section using geologic relative time rules. First thing we like to do always when we get started with a cross-section is take a look at the layers that we have and then take a look at our events. So I can see in my picture here that I do have one unconformity, one section of erosion, and I can see that this section of erosion is offset. So that tells me I also have a fault running through right here, a crack through the layers, and I also have a second fault running through these layers. So I have two faults plus one type of an erosion. And on this image here, I don't have any sky up here. I'm just looking inside the earth at a section, so I'm not going to end up with any surface erosion on this one. Okay, so I know there's kind of two chunks to this cross section, everything happening underneath this erosion and everything happening above the erosion. So if I start here underneath the erosion, I can see that I have two layers right underneath the erosion. I have this white layer and I have this brick layer. Okay, now we have to remember that the fault does offset layers, so this layer here is also the same layer right here, and that would be layer A. Okay, but I know there's still older layers than that. I also have layer C underneath, and that's represented twice because of the fault. And below C, I have layer G. That is the lowest down that this cross section goes. So I know that the G should earn the spot of layer number 1. Working back up then, above G, I have C. That is my number 2. Again, I see C over here. The brick layer, that would be my layer 3. And above layer 3, only on this side, I have layer F, and that should earn my 4. Even though I don't see it here, I still know that that 4 happened after the brick layer, after the limestone. Now I have to decide what happened first. Was it the fault here, or was it my erosional line? Okay, well, if I look at the surface here, I can see that the fault is then eroded. So that gives me a pretty solid clue that the fault here should be number 5. And that would happen before the erosion, because the erosion then came in and evened out the fault. So 6 is going to be an unconformity. Okay? Then looking at my top half above the erosional line, 6 right above that should be layer 7. And again, because of this fault, this piece over here is also layer 7. Working up, this has to be 8. Okay, and I've got one layer left up here. I have to decide, is this going to be 9 or is this going to be 9? And if I think about my cross-cutting rule, I know that because this fault cuts into all these layers, I know this has to come first because anything that cuts into something needs to come second. So 10 is going to be the second fault, fault E. Okay, this cross section only has 10 steps, so I am stopping right here. As we move on to cross section number 10, I know there should be 13 total steps. And if I start to look at my picture and see what kind of erosion I definitely have the surface on this one. So I have my surface erosion line. And this one is also on here, has an erosional contact right here between this angled layers and that flat limestone on top. So I have 2 erosions that I have to look for. Okay. Also on my image, I have a fault. And that is shown here, cutting through these layers. Okay. I can clearly see a wave happening through this section of the cross section. That tells me that I have folding occurring. And layer C here, because it's not a perfect flat layer, I know that this is going to be some kind of igneous rock, which would make it an intrusion. Okay, so I'm looking at all these different events here on my cross section, seeing that there's kind of 2 parts, everything underneath this erosion line and then everything above. And I also have 2 that are going to look at the cross-cutting rule. Okay, the fault and the intrusion. So I've got to look into what's going to happen. Now I know I always start on the bottom to look at my layers. I have two possibilities on the bottom. I have C and I have D. Okay, C, because it's the igneous intrusion, can't be first. D has to exist for it to cut into, as does H, as does A. Okay, now all three of those had to come before either the fault or the intrusion, but I noticed that both D, H, and A all have that wave to them, so they must have been folded. So I'm going to count step number 4 as fold. So I can cross that one off my events list. Now before F and I and B come in, I need to figure out my igneous intrusion along with my fault. And if I look carefully, there's a clear example, a clear reason which one is first. I have my fault here, and I have C, my intrusion here, and I also see a tiny piece of C right in this area. So if C has been cut, that tells me it had to occur before fault G. So I know that my intrusion here has to be number 5, which makes my fault number 6. So I'm just about halfway to my 13 steps. Okay, now this bottom half is kind of done. I'm working my way up. F, I, and B are all important. Working my way up, I've got 7, 8, and 9. One thing I didn't list on my original features was tilted. I didn't notice right away that these layers here have a tilt to them. They're not perfectly horizontal like my limestone layer up here. So I need step 10, running out of room, to be the tilt of those layers. 3 away then from my 13. I've got my intrusion done, I have my fault done, I've talked about the tilt. Now I've got 2 erosions plus 1 layer. That's going to get me to my 13. I've got 11 as the erosion. I've got 12 for the limestone layer E, and I'm going to end on 13 surface erosion. Excellent. If you're still feeling like a challenge, take a look at the very last cross section, number 11. I'm going to get you started here. There is a hint on the bottom that does say O should be my first layer. Okay, that's a big clue. And looking at your rock key, just a reminder, H is an igneous layer, as is layer A. Oops. Okay, so that's a little bit of a hint for you. One other igneous layer is up here on I. So I have quite a few cross cutters to think about. A couple events that I can see happening here is I do have a fault. Another cross cutter to think about. The fault is running right through here. So that has to occur before a couple of the igneous. I definitely have layers that are folded, right? Down here I have O and H got into the fold, as well as B, L, and J got into the fold. So all of those layers have to exist first before the fold, but notice carefully, A here, A isn't folded. So the folding's got to come sometime between J and A getting in there. Okay, I do have a little bit of tilt to these layers up here. Okay, tilt's occurring with D and M. Let's color code those. Tilt happened to these 2 layers. And then my last few features, I do have some erosion. Again, as usual, I've got erosion on the surface. And actually, if we look really carefully, we have surface erosion here, and then K kind of got filled in at the end, and it's pretty flat on top, so I'm going to skip that section for erosion there. I also have 2 erosional areas right around layer G. Both sides of this limestone G has erosion. Okay, so knowing that O is my number 1, if I start working my way through all the folded layers, that should get me a pretty good jump on my 20 number cross section. 20 steps. Okay, again, keep in mind the 3 igneous layers, keep in mind the fault, the fold, and tilt in there before layer G. Good luck.